Good evening, everyone. My name is Fida Adeli, and I'm the director of the Center for Contemporary Arab Studies, as well as an associate professor in the Clovis and Hala Salam Maksud Chair in Arab Studies at Georgetown University. I'd like to welcome you to tonight's event, The Duty to Dissent, Objections to U.S. Policy on Israel and Palestine, hosted by the Center for Contemporary Arab Studies, the African Studies Program, the Al-Walid Center for Christian Muslim Understanding, and the Department of Government. Tonight, our panel consists of U.S. government officials who resigned from their jobs due to serious concerns about current U.S. policy towards the crisis in Gaza and U.S. policies and practices towards Palestine and Israel more broadly. Before I introduce our speakers, I want to acknowledge that there is an ongoing genocide in Gaza with over 40,000 Palestinians killed by Israeli forces. Public health experts estimate the toll is likely much higher, as well as intensified killing, land confiscation, and ethnic cleansing in the West Bank at the hands of Israeli forces and Israeli settlers. Just today, the UN Secretary General, Antonio Guterres, stated, quote, "The level of suffering we are witnessing in Gaza is unprecedented in my mandate as a Secretary General of the United Nations. I've never seen such a level of death and destruction as we are seeing in Gaza in the last few months." At the same time, over 300 Israelis are being held captive by Hamas, Islamic Jihad, and the Gaza Strip, and the failure to stop this terrible violence leaves all of their lives in jeopardy as well. In July of this year, 12 former government officials released a joint statement outlining their reasons for resigning. Tonight, we are featuring 4 of these signatories: Lily Greenberg Call, Harrison Mann, Josh Paul, and Alexander Smith. First, I'd like to introduce Lily Greenberg Call, who's joining us on Zoom. Lily is a former special assistant to the Chief of Staff at the Department of Interior. She has nearly a decade of experience in politics, movement organizing, and domestic and international human rights work. She worked on President Biden's 2020 campaign and served in the administration until May 15th, 2024, when she became the first Jewish political appointee to resign in protest of the US policy in Gaza. Lily grew up doing pro-Israel advocacy with AIPAC and other organizations throughout high school and college, and later became invested in Palestinian rights and Jewish anti-occupation movements. Next, I'd like to introduce Harrison Mann, here with us today, a former US Army major and executive officer of the Defense Intelligence Agency Middle East Africa Regional Center, who resigned in protest of the office's support for Israel during its Gaza campaign. He previously served as a Middle East all-source intelligence analyst and led a crisis cell coordinating intelligence support for Ukraine. Prior to the Defense Intelligence Agency, he worked at the US Embassy in Tunis in the Office of Security Cooperation and led Army Civil Affairs teams combating regional smuggling under US Naval Forces Central Command in Bahrain. Harrison began his Army career as an infantry officer. Sitting with Harrison on the stage, we have Josh Paul. Josh resigned from the State Department in October 2023 due to his disagreement with the Biden administration's decision to rush lethal military assistance to Israel in the context of its war on Gaza. He had previously spent over 11 years working as the director in the Bureau of Political Military Affairs, which is responsible for US defense diplomacy, security assistance, and arms transfers. He previously worked on security sector reform in both Iraq and the West Bank, with additional roles in the Office of the Secretary of Defense, US Army Staff, and as a military legislative assistant for a member of the US Armed Services Committee. Josh grew up between London and New York and holds a master's degree from both Georgetown and St. Andrews in Scotland. He is currently a non-resident fellow at the organization Democracy for the Arab World Now, DAWN, and a recipient of the 2023 Callaway Award for Civic Courage. Finally, we have Alex Smith, also joining us via Zoom. Alex is a lawyer with a background in global health, development, human rights, and international criminal law. He studied law and public health at Northeastern and Tufts and dedicated 22 years to human rights work, including in Afghanistan, Jordan, Sudan, West Africa, Southeast Asia, the Balkans, and in the occupied Palestinian territories. In May 2024, Alex left USAID after 4 years of service due to the agency's policies, statements, and silencing of speech about the health conditions and war crimes in Gaza. Tonight's moderator is Yusuf Monayer. Yusuf is the head of the Palestine and Israel program and a senior fellow at the Arab Center in Washington, D.C. He's also an adjunct professor here in the School of Foreign Service at the Center for Contemporary Studies. So Yusuf will be moderating the discussion tonight, and we will do that for about an hour and then open it up to the audience. Before I hand it over to Yusuf, I will be reading the Georgetown University Speech and Expression Policy. Georgetown University is committed to standards promoting speech and expression that foster the exchange of ideas and opinions. While it is recognized that not everyone may share the same views as the speakers, it is expected that everyone in attendance at this event respect the rights of the speakers and the organizing groups to share their perspectives and ideas by not causing a disruption to the event's activities. At the conclusion of each of the panel, there will be a question and answer session during which you may ask questions and engage in dialogue. At that time, we'll ask everyone to phrase comments in the form of a question. And in the interest of time, we ask that each person be concise and only ask one question. We will also be fielding questions from the online Zoom room. Thank you again for being with us this evening, and I'd like to hand it over to Yusuf.
Thank you so much for that introduction. It's a pleasure and honor to be here with our panelists today and on the screen here behind us, and with all of you in the room and watching online. I look forward to our conversation. I do want to begin by just saying a word or two about the situation on the ground in Gaza. Over the last 11 months, we've seen a scale of destruction in Gaza that is unprecedented. Even though this tiny strip of land has seen far more than its fair share of ugly bombardment and horrific wars over several years, Palestinians there are living through an unprecedented moment in their history. Fadat cited the number of approximately 40,000 who have been killed. These are the numbers that are reported by the health ministry in Gaza, but we also know that that is likely a significant undercount of the real death toll. The numbers have been stuck somewhere in that range now for several months, and we know that there are literally countless bodies that continue to be buried under the rubble. Upwards of 75% of the structures in the Gaza Strip have been damaged or entirely destroyed by the relentless bombardment of the Israeli military's air, sea, and land campaign. Most of the 2.2 million residents are displaced, and all of them are living under really deplorable humanitarian conditions. And this goes beyond mere statistics. The other day, a couple of weeks ago now, we learned that the polio virus, which had been not recorded in the Gaza Strip for 25 years, reared its ugly head when a confirmed case in a 10-month-old child, only as old as the genocide itself, was confirmed paralyzed from the waist down. Interestingly, Gaza, prior to this war, had a higher vaccination rate than some United States when it came to polio. And within a few months, we're already seeing the first signs that this deadly disease is spreading. And given the conditions on the ground, it's likely that things are far worse than what we understand. Yesterday, I learned that 2 young girls, 3 years old and a year and a half old, who just got the polio vaccine through the World Health Organization's rapid deployment of the vaccine in response to this polio case, were injured in an Israeli strike, losing both of their legs and their mother, and their father is also critically injured. These stories repeat every single day and have repeated every single day for 11 months now. And I begin with this precisely because, in my view, and I don't think it's a controversial view, what we are seeing happening in Gaza now for all of these months is made almost entirely possible thanks to US policy. This is an unescapable reality, and it's the reason we are having this conversation today. A few weeks ago, at the start of the semester, just before students got to campus, I received an email from the School of Foreign Service here talking about how Georgetown's graduates are some of the #1, if not the #1 graduates sought after in government and in the Foreign Service in particular. So many students sitting in this room, elsewhere on this campus, and perhaps watching online may very well one day be wrestling with the questions that you all were wrestling with in recent months. And so I want to begin our conversation today by turning to each one of our panelists today and asking them to start off by just sharing a little bit about what your role in government was prior to your decision to step down, what you were involved in a day-to-day basis, and also perhaps say something about why you decided to pursue a career in government to begin with. And maybe we can start on the screen here. Lily, would you like to kick us off?
Sure. I mean, I just want to say thank you for grounding us, Yusuf, in the reality of what's happening right now. As like horrible as it is, and yeah, that I'm still honestly like a little affected from everything that you just said. So I was I was working as a political appointee in the administration. I was the special assistant to the chief of staff at the Department of Interior. So working in the office of the secretary, something, you know, I didn't quite know about the difference between appointees and civil servants until starting to work in campaigns and government, but political appointees have a lot of proximity to power. You know, we tend to be the people who are working closest with principals in the administration. And I had initially, like, I got my start in governments, working in campaigns and doing, you know, volunteer roles and fellowships throughout college, and then actually worked for Senator Harris's, or now Vice President Harris's, presidential race in Iowa in 2019, moved to Arizona when she left the race to work for what would eventually become the Biden team in the general on the coordinated campaign. And then from there, that's how I eventually made my way into the administration. So I feel like my day-to-day was probably a little different than the other folks here. I mean, I had like a pretty bird's eye view of what was going on at the agency, and also kind of beyond that. I mean, some of the politics of the administration overall, and kind of how, you know, I think politicals are kind of we have a really interesting role, or formerly, not we anymore. It's an interesting kind of genre of folks in government, because you are seeing, you know, how the policy is made, how things, how the bureaucracy works, you know, how, at least especially at my level, I was seeing really how the agency functioned. But you're also very much a political appointee, like you are privy to the dynamics of, you know, of the administration, and kind of how your principal or your cabinet secretary, et cetera, is kind of implementing and getting the message of the administration out there. There was a lot of work involved in like travel and kind of planning different events the secretary would do, both in a you know, in an official capacity, and then kind of on the campaign side, and as you know, separately once that started up. So it's kind of one of those roles where you get like an inch into everything, and you're not going super deep necessarily into like a specific policy portfolio. But I think it was very valuable. I mean, Interior is a huge agency. I think one of the biggest, and employs a lot of people across the country. And also for myself in particular, it was very interesting to be working for the first Indigenous cabinet secretary member ever, and the first at Interior, which is a agency that has historically, and I mean still in a lot of ways, marginalizes Native communities, and was responsible for a lot of the their displacement and their struggle. And so to see a lot of folks from those communities working within the system, it was kind of a real masterclass of like working for your community from inside the system. And I felt that I was able to learn a lot from them, and also just felt a lot of gratitude, and that I was given the opportunity to work alongside those folks for their communities.
Thank you, Lily. Alex, do you want to go next?
Sure thing. And thanks again for having all of us. So my experience was sort of the opposite of Lily's, in that I didn't have the bird's eye view. I was very much in the weeds of public health data. As the introduction said, I was a senior advisor for USAID for 4 years, focusing on gender and maternal health, child health, nutrition, and infectious disease. And really enjoyed this work. I was with USAID for 4 years, and before that was with CDC and other US agencies, but before that was with UN agencies all over the place. That's the work that I was doing in Afghanistan and Sudan and elsewhere. And getting to work in policy, especially, was sort of my favorite thing about the job, was getting to pick apart and analyze best practices and figure out how to tweak things in public health, or actually make sweeping changes top down that could literally, save lives. A few months before I left USAID, I was in Zambia working on ways to get malaria medicines to pregnant women more efficiently, and we did find ways to do that with the cooperation of the government. So just within a week, we managed to make things better for some people. So that was a really satisfying career path. And it was also, one of the perks of the job was getting to meet people from all around the world, people of all different nationalities, backgrounds, and religions. One of my formative experiences when I was still an undergrad was working in Pakistan and meeting a lot of Afghan refugees in early 2001, before everything changed, obviously, later in 2001. But from that formative experience, really took away lessons about how a person is a person, no matter where they're from, no matter their religion or, who they are. And so went to law school because I already had in hand that sort of ethos, and decided to really focus on human rights and global health, and where they intersect, and where policies need to be, where countries need to abide by international agreements and enact policies that will protect people's health outcomes. So it was that passion for human rights and global health that first led me to my first experience in Israel and Palestine. That was way back in 2003, when I was a 20-something volunteer with the International Solidarity Movement in Nablus, coincidentally the same organization where Aisha Egzi was killed on Friday. I was volunteering with ISM the same year that Rachel Corrie was killed as well. And I often think about the fact that we were the same age, and she should be my age now, and also doing activism around Israel and Palestine. So those formative experiences really stuck with me throughout all of my career with the UN and with US government. And I hope to continue to look for ways to do that work. It certainly won't be with the US government.
Thank you, Alex. Josh?
Sure, thank you. And it's really good to be back at Georgetown about 24 odd years after I left. 24 very odd years, actually, after I left anyway. So I was always interested in international relations. I studied it in my undergrad program. And as I was about halfway through my senior year and, didn't really have any concept of what I would do next, one of the professors there at the University of St Andrews in Scotland said, well, they have a really good program in national security studies at Georgetown. You should look into that. And I did, and I applied, and I came here. And as many of you who are studying this field here will know, there's really no better place to do it, both in terms of the academic quality, but also because you're plugged into a network from the start. And one thing I think that we know about DC is that despite what we would like people both in this country and around the world to think, it's actually not a meritocracy. It's very much about networks. It's very much about who you know. It's funny, we go around and, within US government are always talking about, those corrupt patronage networks and the Wasta in the Middle East and all this kind of thing. But that's how it works here too. And so starting off here was an opportunity to plug into those networks, which then led me along my career and actually led me into my first job in DC, which I got through the Georgetown, they advertised an internship through the Georgetown Career Service, which was actually in a defense lobbyist. And that was actually a great place to start in DC as well, because guess what? Their job is all about networks. It's all about knowing the defense industry, the Pentagon, members of Congress. And so, with that, with those networks, with those links, set off on what I would have to describe as an array of different jobs. My first decade in DC, working, on the Hill, working for the US government, in Iraq for state and defense back in 2004-05, going back there for the UK government a year later, working in the Office of the Secretary of Defense on Iraq policy, and then going back to the Middle East, and this time living in Ramallah in the West Bank for 14 months for the US Security Coordinator, which is a multilateral with the US led, but joint US, UK, Canada, Netherlands are in there, the Turks are in there, mission to essentially, well, the theory, right, is to build Palestinian security force capacity so that as the Palestinians stand up, the Israelis can stand down. I have to say that in my experience, the first part of that actually was happening. At the time I was there, the Palestinians were standing up. Of course, the problem, and remains the problem, is that the Israelis were never willing to stand down. But that's maybe a discussion for later in the evening. And ended up eventually in DC in the State Department, a place I'd always wanted to work in Maine State, in something called the Bureau of Political Military Affairs, which is responsible for America's defense diplomacy. It does negotiate security agreements with other countries that enable US forces to forward deploy with legal protections. It is responsible for US security assistance, arms transfers, all this sort of thing. And, just as a side note, I think it's interesting, when most people think of these functions of government, they tend to think of the Defense Department, right? You think weapons, you think DoD. But these are authorities and responsibilities vested in State Department, essentially since the Marshall Plan, because these are ultimately tools of foreign policy. These are tools that give the US leverage and influence when we use them, over and with partners around the world. So my specific role there, and one of the things I enjoyed about it, was that in addition to having a policy role and being part of the discussions on policy and the approval chains within the State Department on security assistance, on arms transfers, I was also responsible for the Bureau's relationships with Congress, which has oversight and of course gets notified and goes through a lengthy process, often of deliberation on US security assistance, on US arms transfers. So I was interacting on a daily basis, both within the department on the policy side, and over on the other side of DC with Capitol Hill. And have to say, I did the job for 11 years, which was about 5 times longer than I had done any other job, in great part because it's a really fascinating portfolio. The US touches so many different issues around the world. And you never know, certainly in the Bureau of Political Military Affairs, from one day to the next, what's it going to be? Is it going to be Ukraine? Is it going to be Saudi Arabia? Is it going to be Brazil? Is it going to be the South China Sea? So, a fascinating experience. And then you add into that, the ability to sit there in the room, in the skiffs, in the secure classified briefing rooms with the senators, with the members of Congress, with the senior decision makers, hearing the discussions that are actually going on behind closed doors. So, really fascinating job, and one that I also felt I could contribute to, given my experience in the field and my understanding of what US security assistance looks like, not just from a Washington policy planning perspective, where you're thinking about grand strategy, but what it feels like on the ground, having met, known, and been very close friends with many on the not so nice receiving end of that assistance, both in Iraq and in Palestine.
Thank you, Josh. Harrison.
Yeah, and thanks for having us. So I think I'm the one here who joined the military, and most people do that for some combination of three reasons. I think either for the material benefits, for the excitement or the adventure, because they want to fly an airplane or blow stuff up, or because they have a sense of patriotism or duty, or they think it's a noble endeavor. I was largely motivated by the latter two. It may be hard for some of y'all to imagine. I graduated high school in 2007. This was a time when the fact that the Iraq War was a total disaster was not totally received wisdom, and we were years away from understanding that the war in Afghanistan was also going to become a famous failure. So I started ROTC at the College of William and Mary down the street. I guess y'all don't consider it a rival, but it was a one-way rivalry that we felt. I really liked that. And at the same time, I started taking Arabic. So I was that white guy in the Arabic class who was taking it for the wrong reasons. And that took me to the region a little bit while I was an undergrad, including I spent a month in the West Bank near Bethlehem, purely to learn Arabic. I was so not tapped in at all to the history or what was happening there. But it's impossible not to go there and not see the walls and go through checkpoints and feel it yourself and learn a little bit about it. But I started out in the infantry, which is like patrols in the woods and sleeping in the mud and stuff and on armored vehicles. I decided that was not really my calling, and I thought I would really be able to distinguish myself if I got to move to a job where I could use my Arabic and my limited cultural experience. I started this new position called Civil Affairs, which took me to Bahrain. We were working for the Navy while their big focus was, I guess, the still ongoing Saudi, Yemen, Houthi conflict. There was a time when the Navy was really trying to focus on stopping the flow of smuggled munitions into Yemen. So we worked on that. I got to do a lot of cooperation with different Arab partner militaries. And then finally, I started a position called a foreign area officer, which is sort of the foreign service officer equivalent that the military has, the people who serve in attaché roles. And my designated area was the Middle East, North Africa. So I spent a year in Tunis doing cooperation with the Tunisians and some other regional partners. And then finally, that job had me assigned at the Defense Intelligence Agency, DIA. DIA is basically a smaller CIA that mainly answers to the Secretary of Defense and the Pentagon instead of the entire government, but they perform a lot of the same functions, just with a little more of a military flavor. So the past year, or the last year before I left, I was working as the executive officer, which is a chief of staff, special assistant-ish role, supporting the official who was in charge of all analysis and some operations for the Middle East and Africa. And he also ended up being put in charge of the agency-wide response after October 7th. So we were responsible for all of the analysis about military and defense themes that went to SecDef and the president and everybody in between, and also for intelligence sharing with regional partners. So from that job, I like Lily described, had a bird's eye view for what was going on in DIA, in the intel community at large to a certain extent, and also national policy, including what what the agency and my office in particular were sharing with our Israeli counterparts on a regular basis.
Thank you all for that. I want to get to the why did you resign question, and whether or not there was a tipping point. But before that, I'm curious to understand a little bit. You all got to a point where you confronted an ethical dilemma and made the decision that you simply couldn't do this anymore. And the moment that we're going through is obviously a particularly horrific one. But it's not the first time that U.S. policy has supported war crimes around the world. It's not the first time that U.S. policy has probably enabled genocide in some parts of the world. Before going into government, did you think about whether or not you would confront an ethical dilemma about this these kinds of issues? And how did you think about your role in government as perhaps contributing to changing those realities? Maybe we start the other way around.
Sure. I don't really think anybody joins the military with the expectation that they're going to change. It's kind of like going to work at McDonald's thinking you're going to change the recipe for the Big Mac. Like that doesn't really even enter your head as a possibility. And once you're there, you realize, maybe if you stay in for 40 years, you might be in a role where you can affect some level of change, but it's not really something that happens. And in terms of thinking beforehand about ethical or moral dilemmas, we thought a lot, and we were even trained to a certain extent on what I'd call very tactical dilemmas, like shoot, don't shoot, or you discover your sergeant has been stealing supplies, or sort of office level issues. But nobody ever talked about, including after I was in for a while, the policy level. Are we supporting a policy that's dangerous or immoral or evil? Even while we were beginning to realize within the army, okay, Iraq, we might not have achieved much there. Afghanistan, that didn't go great. There's no culture or expectation that you would examine, what you're helping the United States do and whether that is good or bad.
Yeah. So I'd certainly, studied in undergraduate level sort of, questions of the ethics of international relations. The first time I really began to think about it was actually, here on this campus, where one of the classes I was taking in what was then the National Security Studies program, now the Security Studies program, was nuclear war planning. Great program, by the way. I love that program, and really interesting class. And as part of it, our professor brought in a US Air Force nuclear missile officer, who is one of those guys whose job it was, for a couple of years of their career, to sit in an underground bunker somewhere in North Dakota with a key in their hand, and to be ready to receive the order to put that key in, turn the switch, press the button, and, destroy the world. And, we got a chance to ask questions at the end. My question to him was, would you have done it? If the order came down and you're sitting there in a bunker and the order comes down to, turn the key, press the switch, would you have killed, 20 million people with the flick of that button? And he said, in a second. And so that was the first time that I really, I think came face to face with someone who had been through this sort of dilemma. And, I found it disturbing, and it obviously did, because it's one of the few things that's I can remember the conversation, all the way through to now. I think in my own career, certainly there were, a number of, I think you all make, as you go through your career, certain types of compromises. I think I got better at managing them as I went along in my career, and I think part of that is a function of seniority. The more senior you get, also the longer you serve in the bureaucracy, the more you understand the protections, the flexibilities you have, and how to work with the system to address and overcome some of these issues as you face them. But I also think, my very first own personal experience of these moral dilemmas was when I was in Iraq the first time, and I was 26. and I was, faced with a moral dilemma. And I think I'm still not, frankly, ready to talk about it, but I made the wrong decision. And that is something that I have wrestled with ever since then.
Thank you, Josh. Alex.
Great. So so when I joined, I'm no longer bound by the Hatch Act. I have to remind myself that I can say honestly that I was excited to work for this administration. I joined USAID sort of at the tail end of the Trump administration, and was really banking on hoping that the election would go in a way that would allow me to work for a more progressive and human rights respecting administration. There's some irony there, and that my boss was Samantha Power, who was somebody that I knew from the Kennedy School at Harvard, who was a wonderful writer and professor and speaker on human rights issues. She's written books about genocide called The Problem from Hell. I've read all of her books about how humanitarian aid work should be improved, how it can do better, how US policy should facilitate improvements. So yeah, I was completely blindsided by my people that I looked up to as role models, to include Harris and Biden, suddenly making this decision, this bizarre decision, in my opinion, to completely trample systems of international law and human rights. And I never felt like I had any ability to change minds. We'll get to it probably later, but what I had hoped to do with the presentation back in May was to at least shine a spotlight that would be hard to ignore on the very predictable maternal and child health outcomes that were guaranteed to happen if you bomb all of the water and sanitation facilities, if you starve people, if you crowd people into very small spaces without proper hygiene and sanitation. It's going to lead to disease outbreaks. So that's what I had hoped to do, is a very, very small protest that would have been seen by maybe 30 or 40 people. And that's what I was prevented from doing, which inevitably led to my resignation. But short answer was no, I never expected to have to be in this position, and I never had any influence over senior decision making.
Lily?
I definitely, by the time that I joined the administration, was involved in like quite a bit of movement organizing, and I think I am a little younger than some of the other folks on this panel. I think my generation has grown up with a lot of disillusionment about our government and its ability to and desire to take care of us, and to build the world that we want to see, and also to rise to some of the challenges that we're facing, right, in this time. So I was definitely thinking about what it meant to be kind of on the inside, and I don't know that I definitely did think a little bit about Israel-Palestine and how that would play. And I think by the time I joined, I had because of my background growing up, I was very familiar with like the reality of the US-Israel relationship and the steadfast bipartisan support for Israel, and so was not really under any illusions about how that works. And by the time I joined the administration, I was starting to think critically about it and involved with some Jewish and Palestinian solidarity movements, and organizing within my own community to end Jewish support for the occupation. So I thought about it a lot. I spoke to some trusted friends about it. I think one thing that I ended up kind of landing on was that at this point, there is not a lot of crossover between especially younger folks in movement spaces and government. There's not a lot of people who've had exposure to both of those worlds or experience in government and in electoral politics, and then who also work in movement spaces. And I think that's a problem. I did my undergrad at Berkeley, a place where I I would say, an active discouragement of changing the system from the inside, at least like within the student body culture. And I understand that to some extent, but I also always felt a little bit resistant to it. You know, I think we live in the world that we do. Like in Judaism, there's these two concepts. There's like olam hazeh and olam haba, the world that is and the world that's to come. And you can think of it as like the afterlife and the present life, but a lot of people interpret it, especially in terms of organizing, as like the world we have now and the world that we want to build. And to get to the world to come, we have to be like really rooted in the world that we have now and be really, you know, practical. We kind of have to hold two things. Like we have to push people to believe in things that aren't politically possible, right? And really like believe in a future we can't see yet, and recognize that we're working in an imperfect, flawed system and world, and that we have to be pragmatic about how to actually achieve the things that we want. So I was someone who thought that you know, went into politics and government because I wanted to change the world. I think kind of the opposite of what you were saying, Harrison. And you know, some of that might seem a little bit naive, but I have met some of the most wonderful, like committed, passionate people in both campaigns and government, who are also really committed to changing the world. And I think went in with some ideas of like the limitations of that. I think one of the challenges was, I mean, once October 7th happened, it was incredibly personal and hit very, very close to home for me. And then, you know, immediately, I think even like the same day, I was very clear-eyed about that the response would be atrocious, and that what, you know, the way Palestinians would be collectively punished would be worse than anything that I had ever seen, and that a lot of people had ever seen. And so, again, was under no illusions about like the way the US-Israel relationship works. But I think what really struck me was the kind of callousness that was displayed by a lot of administration leadership about Palestinian lives. And then also the fact that there was this widespread dissent that I felt among my colleagues, among my peers, from people across the administration, from people on the Hill, who were all kind of in agreement, you know, at varying levels and for different reasons sometimes, that how we were handling this was really poor and really bad, and that seemed to not be able to make it to the top in any way that would create meaningful change in policy. And that was incredibly disillusioning, and incredibly frustrating, because I saw it wasn't like that on every issue.
Thank you, Lily. So each of you ultimately made the decision to resign. That happened, I believe, at different moments for each of you. Can you share with us about what precisely went into that decision? Was there a specific tipping point? Was there a process of wrestling with this decision? Did you consider other sort of avenues for expressing dissent internally? What other conversations did you have with colleagues? Was there a sense of support for a decision like that? Share with us your experiences around that. Harrison.
Sure. So I did two steps. One was submitting my resignation packet. That was November 1st, which is a very slow process to get out of the Army, and you can do it quietly and you can reverse it if you change your mind. And then months later, I decided to share why I was doing it. I was able to make that decision November 1st, less than a month after the war began, because in addition to seeing all of the very disturbing imagery and videos that I'm sure y'all saw coming out of Gaza, I could see how our government was deliberating about it. And I felt really hopeless that things were going to change. You know, it was in addition to being well aware that the Israelis were not just indiscriminately bombing and inflicting these very large casualty counts, which, by the way, were very apparent to us from the start. There was no dispute inside the intel community about how many Palestinians were being killed. And seeing that they were, with their own justifications, but they were targeting medical facilities and other key infrastructure that should be protected. And then looking at what our reaction was, which was pretty much nothing. And because of my job, I was able to see that there was concern that we were going to be implicated by sharing intel that then might be connected to gross violations of human rights. So people did have that concern. People high up. And that was resolved the way that, Josh can probably comment on this on the arms sales side. We will accept the credible assurances of our Israeli counterparts. And that was the end of that discussion. And so I understood that at the national level or at the level of the floor that I worked on, we were not going to be moderating our level of support based off of the killing of civilians. And yeah, that was clear by November 1st. And then at my last day in the office, it was April 3rd. And at that point, about 6 unprecedented events had happened that at the moment, the press and also hopeful me thought was really going to finally make the president put his foot down from, more deliberate targeting of medical facilities in January when U.S. troops were killed as a fairly direct result of our support for Israel's war. And then finally, the Iran shooting missiles into Israel, which is not a sign that your policy is going well, and also Israel killing the World Central Kitchen workers. And none of that changed anything. And I understood that I could not, people would listen to me because of my job, because I'm Jewish, because I was an intel officer, because I was a military officer. And so I felt like if I didn't say something, whatever that might accomplish, I was going to regret it for the rest of my life.
Josh?
Yeah, so in some ways I was in a similar bucket to Harrison in the sense that, being within the national security establishment in government, it was also my impression very soon after the war began that the scale and scope here were vastly different than anything we'd seen before, and B, that the US government was not interested in doing anything seriously to stop it, to press the Israelis to stop it. And I have to say that I'm a little bit shocked that that's still the case 11 months later. But there hasn't been a change there. The added consideration for me as well was that, and perhaps this is, one of the reasons or the reason that it, was on October 17th, actually, that I handed in my resignation. October 18th was my last day, was that I was also part of the arms transfer approval process, right? So the Israelis were coming in from October 8th onwards saying, okay, we need, these many thousand firearms and we need these new intelligence systems and these new weapon systems. And part of my role was being one of the people who said yes. And I was not willing to do it. I had reached out within my own chain of command and a bit more broadly across the State Department after October 7th to say, hey, I know what's coming. Before we start saying yes, can we just pause for a second and realize, first of all, that our policy for 20 years has been security for peace, that we will provide Israel with security so it feels it can make peace. Clearly, that's not working, right? There's no peace, and it's clear there's also no security, including for Israel. So first of all, and second of all, we've seen this before. We've seen previous cycles of violence. We know this is going to be so much worse. So let's just pause and have a discussion. And there was absolutely no interest in pausing and having a discussion. There was not even any interest in going forward, but also having a discussion. It was simply this rush to arm, this unquestioning embrace of Prime Minister Netanyahu in a literal sense, right? President Biden went out and literally embraced Prime Minister Netanyahu, and with that, the floodgates were open. And so I think this, as I said, so the scale and the scope of what was unfolding, the absence of debate, the sort of tail end of what had been, I think, a failed policy in the Middle East for many years, and it had been my sense since working out there in 2008 that the Oslo process was dead and that the long-term path we were on even then was ethnic cleansing. And so, the only final consideration, as Harrison just said as well, is that, there was, even on October 17th, October 18th, a policy discussion to be had about the US policy of providing these lethal arms. And if it couldn't be had within government, then it had to be had by the American people. But I think one of the things you sign up for when you go into government is that if that's a conversation you want to bring to the American people, you have to go out of government to have it. And so that's what I did.
Al?
Yeah, so first I just wanted to share with both Harrison and Josh that I went through the same emotional turmoil of thinking every time there's a massive story that makes the news, like the World Central Kitchen targeting, I always think of surely now it has to stop. This all has to stop at some point, but it never stops. So I certainly shared that frustration for the last 11 months. I think we all do. In my case, the tipping points were a series of events. Back in January, February of this year, I was writing letters to our administrator and dissent cables. We all were in USAID, hundreds of us, condemning what was happening and US policy that was stoking the fires that continued to make it happen. But I wanted to go a step further than my colleagues and talk to my agency and partners about maternal and child health outcomes in Gaza. So I prepared and submitted an abstract back in February to a conference of USAID staff and partners that was going to be happening in May. To my surprise, it was accepted. Out of 350 some abstracts, mine was deemed by 35 reviewers to be an important topic to discuss. It was a conference on gender and maternal health and child health topics. So I really wanted to talk about this for several reasons. I thought that it was important to light a fire under USAID leadership because there was a very obvious lack of urgency. We weren't giving Gaza the same kind of language and attention that we did for Ukraine. I volunteered on the Ukraine Rapid Response Team, the planning of rebuilding health systems in Ukraine the day after it was possible to start doing that rebuilding. There were no such plans for Gaza, and that was shocking. So I thought naively, maybe they don't know how bad it is. So I thought I'll do this speech, and whatever flack I get, that'll be that. And also I wanted to join the chorus of public health experts around the world who are sounding this alarm that for every Palestinian civilian who's killed with a bomb or bullet, we can expect 4 or 5 times as many to be killed by preventable infectious disease, starvation, malnutrition. And that chorus is getting louder and louder. You'll find that back in October, it was Meghan McCain and a few other prominent people saying starvation is happening in late October. Human Rights Watch was talking about starvation as a war crime, starvation as a weapon in December of 2023. And more people are making that case now. So I wanted to also make that case from within USAID, talk about how the Israeli policies of cutting off water, blocking fuel and food and medical supplies, bombing water and sanitation infrastructure, and crowding people into very small spaces was guaranteed to predictably kill tens of thousands, perhaps hundreds of thousands of Palestinians, starting with children who are the most susceptible to starvation and infectious disease. I wanted to make the case that Israel's policies were then and are still now guaranteed to lead to disease outbreaks in the maternal health space, which was one of my areas in my portfolio. These policies will lead to greater risk of maternal death from bleeding, infection, and preeclampsia. These are the leading 3 causes of maternal death. And also the ability to treat those 3 causes is also severely diminished. I love that you, by the way, mentioned that Gaza's vaccine rates were much higher than in some US states. Also interesting that I found from our own funded DHS data and UNFPA data was that Gaza's maternal mortality ratio in 2022 was shockingly low. It was actually slightly lower than the United States. It was lower than the regional average, much lower than the UN Sustainable Development Goals, about less than 20 per 100,000 births, particularly surprising when you consider the challenges of not always having clean water and proper nutrition, thanks to the embargoes around the Strip. So I wanted to also go on the record and say that the health outcomes in Gaza are not always bad, and when we see maternal mortality spike this year and next year in 2024, that is the result of conflict. That was not inevitable in Gaza. It's not a third world place where these things just happen. These were our policies making them happen. So that was what I set out to do. And very long story short, I was told 2 days before I was going to present that there was a problem, that my presentation had to be edited by senior USAID leadership. And they were very frank with me. They told me that one of the reasons was that very day, the ICC prosecutor had requested a warrant for Yoav Gallant and Benjamin Netanyahu. And so it became a more sensitive issue to talk about. So shockingly honest with that excuse. So I was given a lot of State Department talking points about how to speak about Gaza according to our State Department. I was given a very Orwellian language guide marked sensitive but not secret, outlining approved and unapproved words. Forbidden words included Palestine, Palestinian to refer to Arab Israeli citizens. Couldn't say Israel-Gaza border, couldn't show a very accurate map of Gaza's borders. So I did comply with that and offered to do the presentation without slides if I could just be able to talk about it. But then the day before my presentation, it was first deleted from the conference website, and then I was told that I would not be presenting. So that was certainly shocking and disheartening to know that of all the public health issues we can talk about Afghanistan, we can talk about Syria, we can talk about Ukraine, certainly. We even provide funds to report, to document human rights abuses in Ukraine. But we can't talk about Gaza. So that was the tipping point for me. It's a long story made longer.
We appreciate that, Alex. Lily.
I don't know that I had one specific moment. I think, I felt pretty quickly after October 7th that I was out of alignment with how the administration and the president and administration leadership were, their rhetoric and how they were handling this. And I did, as you asked, Yusuf, like for a while, for at least the first few months, even as I was feeling this and experiencing this really, kind of horrible environment where so many of my coworkers, especially if they weren't white, felt that they could not speak up honestly about how they were feeling and about how this was impacting them. And then, I had the kind of whiplash of experiencing a lot of empathy and kindness from my colleagues regarding the Israeli people that I lost and that I was close to, and people in my community who lost a lot of loved ones on October 7th. But then not experiencing that when I would talk about my Palestinian friends who I was worried about in the West Bank, or people that I was connected to in Gaza, or just friends of mine who had family there, and was, and I was equally distressed about them and didn't receive even just the kind of human response that I would expect from a human being, from a person. So that was really jarring. But I, even through that, I was like, okay, I do have this positionality and this proximity to power and the opportunity as an appointee to, you know, attend these like listening sessions that happened for Jewish appointees, for Palestinian and Arab and Muslim appointees, you know, these opportunities that were sort of given to us as an offering to like an extension of you know, a space to listen, a space to be heard, and even just engaging with other appointees and appointee leadership and other Jewish appointees. You know, I felt that I came to realize that like I had that I was one of the only people, especially the only Jewish people in my circles of political appointees who was really actively speaking up about this and you know, really expressing my dismay and disgust with administration policy, with Israeli government policy, and also you know, really just pushing back on the way the administration was talking about October 7th and Jewish safety and Israeli safety overall as a justification for what is being done to Palestinians in Gaza and in the whole country, and kind of, yeah, I just felt that I was one of the only people who was really actively and vocally doing that, in part because I think, you know, compared to some of my other colleagues, like I didn't feel afraid to do that because I was, you know, I mean, I'm Jewish and I'm white, and I just felt like they couldn't tell me that I didn't know what I was talking about, and they also couldn't tell me that I didn't care about Jews or Israelis, or what happened on October 7th, you know, given how close it was for me. So I spent a good amount of time trying to work within those circles and do what I felt that I could from the inside, and was like more optimistic in the fall and winter about my ability to do that, about our collective ability to do that. As you know, it was very, very clear, as Alex mentioned, the USAID dissent cables, there were dissent cables in state, there was all sorts of you know, kind of dissent coming out of the administration, both some that was public and a lot that was also private and internally expressed. And then I think over the course of the spring, I mean, this also just got worse and worse and worse. And there kept being these, you know, different things that would happen that you would think, oh, this will be the time where something changes. And it became very clear that that was not going to happen. You know, and that, yeah, I mean, just that both, you know, the Israeli government, of course, and the United States government were not interested in saving lives, and were not interested in protecting people. And I think I realized at a certain point, came to a realization that I had to leave for myself. I mean, even though my role was not, you know, my role did not have anything to do really with foreign policy, with Israel-Palestine policy, with defense or anything like that. But I still felt as an appointee that I was representing the administration and representing the president in particular. And he was my ultimate boss. And I was angry with him and furious at him, and did not feel like administration leadership cared about the safety and security of a lot of people that I care about immensely, and both Palestinians and Israelis, and you know, and Palestinian and Jewish communities here in the United States and abroad, and also that they were clearly, you know, willing to, like, they weren't thinking about the political implications for the election, for it just felt like they were willing to throw so much away, and for what. And I came to a realization that, one, I was not going to be able to have any influence from the inside. I mean, if anything, it became very clear to me that like my career could be impacted by what I was saying and how I was speaking up. And I was kind of fine with that. I had a moment where I, you know, realized with myself, like, yeah, if I stayed in for another 10 years or something, maybe I would get to a point where I could in the future have decision-making power on this issue, but this issue was too close, and this is my communities. And if I wasn't going to be saying something now today, I also I forget who said it, but I wasn't going to be able to live with myself in the future. And so I eventually came to a point where I felt like I had to leave because I could no longer be in integrity with myself. But then I also very much realized that I had much more power on the outside, right? Like if I wasn't in integrity with myself working for the administration anymore. And I also had no more power in there. And something that I have been, kind of doing in some of the organizing and movement work that I've done for a few years now is talking about the ways that anti-Semitism is weaponized and the ways that Jewish safety is very much used as a cover for some of the real reasons why there is such continued U.S. support for Israel, the military-industrial complex, and Christian Zionism, and U.S. military interests. And I came to a point where I realized, so much of the work that people in my community are doing is to try and kind of rip that curtain away and make a distinction between between the, to really say that this is actually not for us. And this is not helpful for us. And this actually does not keep us safe. Not to mention, of course, what it means for Palestinians. But I realized that I actually had an ability to do that on a very large scale. And if it in any way could contribute, even in a very, 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 very small way, to stopping what's happening right now, I felt that I had a moral obligation to do that. That it was, if anything, completely in line with the reasons why I joined the government and why I have been interested in public service, and with the values that I learned my entire life as a Jewish person, and as a person in the world. And so it ended up feeling like the most, like it felt like, yeah, I not that I had no choice, but that I had to resign, and that once I made that choice, I was like, I think I have to do it publicly, because I wanted to tell the people around me that I was working with why I was leaving, because I think they were all shocked, because I did really enjoy, my job and my colleagues. And but I was like, if I'm going to tell them, then I might as well, there was, as you were saying, Josh, like there was no, I felt like I would have been sacrificing so much an ability to change public sentiment and narrative if I left quietly, and that was not worth it because there are lives on the line.
Thank you very much for that, Lily. I have many, many questions for all of you. But I know that many in our audience have questions as well, and I'm sure those online. So we'll transition now to our Q&A period. If those in the room, if you have questions, if you don't mind lining up at the microphone, and we'll try to mix in some questions from the room and from online. If you want to get started here, let us know to who you're addressing your question. And I see a lot of people lined up, so let's try to keep them brief.
Thank you, everybody, for this event. I think I heard, my impression is that the reason or the motivations behind your resignation was very much not being able to live with this reality. So I think now my question is, how do you understand the responsibility now that you're out? And what kind of work and what can you possibly do to, if I may, repair kind of a lot of the things that in your roles have approved perhaps and facilitated and perhaps been part of. Yeah, so what now? What can we do possibly if I were in your shoes? What are you doing? Thank you.
Thank you. Anyone want to begin responding to that?
Yeah, thank you for that. And I think about that a lot. I kind of thought that I'd break my story, have a very busy couple of weeks, go on vacation, and start a new life. That didn't happen, because what I suspected and then played out is I don't think this is fair, but a lot of people were willing to listen to me, and because I was in the army because I was a DIA, because I'm white, because I'm Jewish. I got into rooms that I knew my friends, like my Palestinian American friends who know much more about this topic and have been working on it and advocating for it years longer than me, that they were not going to be able to get into. And so, for me, as long as people are still inviting me in, maybe not knowing what they're actually going to get, I feel like I've got an obligation. I think most of us have been around the Hill, talked to members of Congress and their staffs. It's a very slow, iterative process, but if anything is going to help push the ball, that's one thing. Some of us have done different public and media engagement. We've said things on TV that people were not saying 6 months ago or a year ago. And all of it feels like a drop in the bucket. And I don't still feel super hopeful, but we are trying very gradually to push the ball forward in a way that at least I feel like unfortunately, not a lot of other people have the ability to do.
Anyone else want to jump in here?
I wanted to just add, for me personally, I'm determined now to get back to my roots and get back into human rights law work. Long ago, I did a fellowship with the ICC, Office of the Prosecutor, Legal Advisory Section, and I'd love to get back into that kind of work. Elephant in the room, it pays less, but it's worth it to have your self-respect and to have your soul intact. It's certainly, it's worth it. And so for me, that's going to be the path, is to get back into that kind of work. I was just having a meeting earlier today with researchers at Harvard who are excited about collaborating on some research around proving intent, basically by looking at the lack of randomness in the targeting of water and sanitation facilities, hospitals, and so on, so that someday, if there is a tribunal or in the court of public opinion, if it needs to be proven that Israel has intentionally caused some of these negative health outcomes, that we'll be working on that.
Thank you, Alex. I want to throw in a question that comes from online here to our panelists. We hear from policymakers and we tell our students that their voice matters. And if they make their voices heard, it can change policy. Josh, you referenced some of the public opinion and shifting public opinion as perhaps a way to push administration officials into doing something different. This question asks, why do you think the Biden administration refuses to shift its policy towards Israel, despite the mass atrocities it's committing in both Gaza and now increasingly in the West Bank as well?
Yeah, I mean, first I want to just reinforce the underlying premise there to begin with, which is that I think our voices do matter. I think, we have seen that, first of all, beyond this issue, it's very clear on most issues in this system that our voices do matter. And I honestly do think that as much as the administration hasn't shifted really one iota on this, that certainly things like the uncommitted movement and things like the student campus protests really have informed certainly the administration's tone and are forcing them to think about a number of these issues. This is going to be a long-term effort. This is going to be, a marathon and not a sprint, as they say. I said that to someone the other day, and they said, "Yeah, but at least in a marathon, you're not running in place." But I think the fact is that we are facing also many years of a very deeply entrenched, very effective ecosystem of political pressure and linkages and international relations that have entrenched and that have built a political economy in which there is no incentive for politicians to speak truthfully on this, even if they know, and many of them do, what the truth is. And in fact, the incentives run the other way. The incentive structure in terms of fundraising, in terms of votes, because of the way money works in our politics, is for politicians to compete who can be the most pro-Israel. And just another example of that this week, right, was after the murder of Aishanur, there was a Florida member of Congress who stood up on Twitter to say, this is great. The idea that for our elected officials, it is easier to celebrate the killing of an American than to criticize the country that did it, I think indicates how deep the problem is and how difficult it is going to be to shift it. But I do think it will shift. And I think it will shift first as a function of our voices and American public opinion. Second, frankly, as a function of Israel's continuing descent down the hole it is digging itself and the distance it is putting itself between where it is going and common human decency. And third of all, the fact that, you know, there is now a cost that there has not been at a geopolitical level to our support for Israel. And I think over time that cost will only increase. We see it in our credibility. We see it in our relations across the Middle East and across the global South. And over time, America is going to have to make a different strategic calculus. So I do think that change is coming. I think that we have to continue to raise our voices because the important thing is that that change comes in time to save what is left of the Palestinian people.
Thank you, Josh. Did any others want to get in on answering that question? No, we'll move on to the next one from the room, this one from the left here.
Right. Hello, my name is Prakriti and I'm a first year in the SFS. My question is addressed to no one in particular, but as a new voter, the way the Biden administration has handled this issue will definitely play a part in how and if I will vote in this election, as well as a lot of the young Americans today. In your expert opinions, how do you think will this year's elections change the course of the genocide in Gaza, regardless of whether it's Vice President Harris or former President Trump?
Thank you very much for that question.
I'm looking at Lily. She can't tell.
Yeah. I was gonna do raise hand, but yeah, I mean, I just want to say, like, it's very bleak, and I really understand and resonate with a lot of people, especially young people, you know, feeling like election after election, we have to sort of bite our tongues about something. And you know, not necessarily not feeling like we have a lot of good options. What I will say, I think about a few things. I think about one, that concept that I was talking about of sort of like the world to come and the world we have now. And I also think about what Angela Davis has said, which is that voting is about choosing the conditions under which we want to organize. I do think that, you know, I mean, the worst case scenario is happening to Palestinians right now, right? And I really do not want to downplay that, and I don't want to say that, like, you know, I mean, I don't want to say that the Democrats are any quote unquote better, right? Because it's very clear that what's happening is the worst case scenario. And, you know, we've seen, I mean, we saw at the DNC, like, we have seen a refusal by the party and party leadership to even platform and humanize Palestinian Americans in the way that they deserve. But I do think, you know, I also kind of think about it like the whole put on your own oxygen mask first. I think we do have, as Josh was saying, we do have, our voices do matter. We do have ability to organize in this country, to vote, to shift both public sentiment and policy with our power as voters and as constituents. And we do have to be in this for the long game. And I think in the situation we are in right now, a Democratic administration is a better option than a second Trump administration for everyone in the region, for people here at home. I think we can't, you know, we do have more of an ability to change policy under a Democratic president. I think the thing that's very frustrating right now, and as someone who, you know, used to work for Vice President Harris and is familiar with people on her team, while I was in the still in the administration, there were definite allies that we had on her staff. You know, there were reports that people in her office were, you know, at odds with folks in Biden's team about how we were handling Gaza, about the policy, about, you know, pressuring them to shift to a more humane policy. I feel a little dismayed about the choices that the campaign is making right now. I think they are, I think every single thing that's happening right now is in service of getting elected and winning the election. And I think they're making the sort of false calculus that a shift to the right, to the quote unquote median voter, is what's necessary to do that. I don't know that that's an accurate calculus. I actually think, you know, ignoring young people, I think ignoring the Arab American and Muslim American constituencies and the people that care about them is not a smart calculus. And I think that, you know, I know that there are people working very, very hard to convince campaign and Democratic Party leadership that they are making the wrong choice. And I can't say, again, like I am not going to be here virtually and promise that anything would be that different under a Democratic administration regarding Palestinians and Palestinian lives. But I think our ability to make that change will drastically decrease under a Trump administration. And I think we have to think about what that means for us at home and for the people that we care about abroad.
Thank you, Lily. I want to take another question here from the online audience. What advice do you have, and this is not addressed to anyone in particular, for soon-to-be and recent graduates who will be looking for job opportunities in the international relations and foreign service fields, who are concerned about being hired, but also making sure that their jobs align with their morals regarding Palestine and Israel? Additionally, what advice do you have for the same group of people who are worried about being blacklisted from jobs because of their advocacy for Palestine and Palestinians?
I'll jump in on this. I think there's a lot of really wonderful things that you can end up doing working for the U.S. government, foreign service, military, intel world. There's a lot of people doing work that I think if any of y'all were doing it, and whoever's asking the question, you would feel proud of doing that. So I'm not going to say avoid these careers altogether. The other side of that is most of the people you work with, when it comes down to, we've discovered they're going to be cowards. And they are not going to do the right thing when they're presented with a moral dilemma. And I can say that with confidence now because there's a dozen of us, and about half of us are actually from the NatSec world. And so that's 6 out of the maybe 1,000, 2,000 people who are working in their office every day to advance the administration's Israel policy. And so you need to be thinking about when you take this job, and I say take the job, you need to be watching out for that moment because it's usually not going to be obvious. It's not going to be, no one's going to come to you and ask you if they should, you know, if you want to blow up the nursery. It's going to be setting up a meeting or signing off on something or being part of some process that's normally a check the box with no serious deliberation. That's going to be maybe 10% of your job, and the other 90% you're going to love. And so I think, you know, I was not even aware of that kind of dilemma or that's the way it would work when I entered the Army. But I realized that's what I was doing, and that's why I quit. So I suggest people who are interested in this line of work to pursue it, but you need to be thinking hard every day about where your red line is going to pop up. Because again, you're not really going to even know what it is until it appears. And I'll tell you right now, if you say, well, I would never do that. I'd never do what Harrison did and work for 6 months helping give intel to the Israelis while they were bombing Gaza. I'm just going to say, I want you to go in thinking that, but most people think that, and then they end up not doing it because they're scared. So serve abroad, but think hard every day.
See, Alex has his hand raised there.
Yeah, just briefly, I would add to what Harrison was saying. This may be preaching to the choir, but really everyone who wants to go into government service that could have anything to do with our foreign policies, I think, should take a course in human rights law. Doesn't matter what sort of profession you're going into, if you're going to be contacting these issues, if you're going to be dealing with these moral dilemmas. You know, my law school didn't offer a course in international criminal law, so I audited one at Harvard, and that's how I managed to get my foot in the door at the ICC. But when you just have that really basic understanding of what human rights violations are, you know, for example, when Israel says it's okay that we bomb this place because we forced all the civilians to move, well, no, that displacement was a war crime. That doesn't make it okay. You know, that kind of thing. If you are in a federal agency and you look around you and you find that your policies are very much against human rights law, then that would be your red flag right there. That would be the time to start getting your resume ready.
Thank you, Alex. We're running close to our end of time for this session, but I know there's a lot more questions online that we're not going to be able to get to, and a number in the room. Why don't we take one from this side and one from this side, and we'll try to get responses from our panelists here before we have to close. So your question, and then we'll take a second question, and we'll round up responses.
Thank you so much for being here today. My name is Muna, and I'm one of the first-year students in the MSFS program. And my question is for everyone, but mainly geared towards Harrison and Josh. And I was wondering if after these 11 months, do you still think that there is room for dissent within seniority? Hearing the way that you talked about some of the senior level officials and how they're, you know, putting pen to paper in ways that might not tell you exactly what you're doing in those meetings, but you are implicitly creating an action. I'm wondering if you think that there's a reason why those officials who are in those levels of seniority haven't resigned, haven't made a statement. Do they think that their hands are tied, or are they just worried that they're losing their jobs? And for those of us who are in MSFS and hoping to be diplomats, we want to know this information before we enter into these roles. Thank you.
Okay, and over here.
Hi, I'm Blaze. I'm also in the MSFS program, and thank you for being here today. So my question is, you know, where do you feel like the change is coming, and sort of to what extent, you know, to that extent, what will it take for the United States to shift its policy in Gaza? Thank you.
Okay, well,
Go on.
so Muna, you asked my favorite question, because it's something that used to drive me crazy. Why are people still doing this? At both low levels and at the very high levels, I think since we all quit, we get a lot of intel about what people in the NSC and the administration are doing from journalists and others. There's people who really just don't care, or they're selective sociopaths, but there's not that many of those. But that's some of it, right? There are people who I think are a little bit delusional, and they're like, yeah, this is terrible. We acknowledge this is terrible, but this is actually, and this is what people have told us about people in administration. This is terrible. We are actually managing it as best as possible. This is the best it could possibly be going. And they really think that. I don't think they're right, but they believe that. And I think there's a far greater number of people who know it's wrong, know it's going badly from a policy perspective, and self-justify in different ways. And some of it, I get it, people don't want to lose their job. There's a lot of people are worried, like the question that you said about becoming a persona non grata in the DC ecosystem. And then there's a lot of people, and I've gone to some of my friends at the administration and tried to kind of shake them by the collar and say, what are you still doing in here, man? And they have this idea, well, yeah, this is bad. It's not good that I'm contributing to it. But if I stay in now, in 10 years, I'll be in the position where I can make some change. And I call that the, waiting for the next genocide and then I'll do something argument. And I don't like that much either.
Yeah, I don't have too much to add to that. I agree with that. I think for a lot of people as well, certainly people in more senior levels, I've found, first of all, if you're talking about political appointees, Senate confirmed individuals, they are there because President Biden has, or Secretary Blinken, or whoever it might be, has put them there. And so first of all, they do often come with a very fair sense of loyalty. Secondly, many of these people are also, remember the US is dealing with many crises around the world, and, to convince some people that this is the issue you need to leave over when you feel that you are saving the world in Ukraine or stopping the world from blowing up in Taiwan or whatever it might be. You know, I think for people it is, you know, more abstract. And I honestly think as well that one of the differentiators, and we've heard this, I think, from all of the panelists, is I think for people who have worked and lived overseas, it is in some ways a much easier decision than for those who have spent their whole time in the Beltway, because, you know, there are faces that we put to these experiences and, you know, memories and all that sort of thing. So I think that's an aspect as well. On the question of, you know, what is it going to take? You know, so, you know, in the long term, I'd refer you to what I just said. In the short term, I don't know that there is anything Israel can do that will put President Biden, or for that matter, future President Harris or Trump, over the line where they will say, okay, enough, stop it, we're cutting off the weapons. On the contrary, my fear is that Prime Minister might think to himself, what better way to ensure continued US support than escalating into Lebanon? Because, and frankly, I mean, that's a concern of mine, right, for several reasons. One of which is that I think, you know, it's ultimately in Netanyahu's interests that Trump be elected. That's, by the way, I think, not necessarily a vote for Harris, but that's another reason not to support Trump. But also, I fear that, you know, if there is a war in Lebanon, now we have about 80 members of Congress who've called for a permanent immediate ceasefire and several dozen who've written letters to President Biden calling on him to suspend arms transfers to Israel. I think we would lose half of them overnight if there was a war between Israel and Hezbollah. So unfortunately, I think right now the answer to what will stop this is in Benjamin Netanyahu's grim and ugly hands. And that is such a handing off of the US national interest, of US values to the extent they exist. It is just something I think that history will scratch its head over, the sacrifices we have made for this man and this set of policies that this Israel is pursuing for a very long time.
Lily and Alex, before we wrap.
I think you've said it all. I hope that a approved warrant for Netanyahu would make a difference, but it probably won't. Yeah, possibly the ICJ deciding that it is genocide conclusively could make a slight difference. A Trump administration could make a difference in that it would at least polarize the world into Israel and the United States doing horrible things and the civilized world on the other side. That could lead to something, but again, probably not.
I don't know. I don't know that I have much else to add. I mean, I agree with Josh's analysis about Lebanon, and I think, you know, I don't know. I mean, there's a part of me that thinks, like, yes, if this had been happening under a Trump administration, at least we would have, you know, more Democrats who would have been willing to speak up against it. But I also think that can sometimes be a dangerous. I mean, I just think the cost of, I don't know that we should, again, and this is not to say that, you know, the lives that are being lost right now are not equally as important, but I do fear and worry that you know, the power of a second Trump term and what that would cost us, both at home and abroad, is really, really terrifying. And we would, you know, I mean, again, lose, I think, all of our ability to use the collective power that we have and that has been built in the last 10 months because of how much public opinion has changed, and how in a lot of ways what's happened in Gaza has polarized a lot of people against you you know, the continued violence and status quo of oppression of the Palestinian people. I don't know, I have like a little tiny twinge of optimism about the anti-government protests in Israel. And I think it's very important to encourage that and support that. And, you know, I am hopeful that Israelis can be a part of dismantling the apartheid regime, even though, you know, I know that's not always a popular opinion, but I do think it's very, very clear after 10/7 and the last 10 months that the Israeli government does not care about nor prioritize its own people's lives. And I think that will in the long run change the status quo. But yeah, I don't know. We're up against quite a bit. But I think we have to think a lot about the long game here. And again, the world that we're trying to build that we might not see.
Thank you very much, Lily. I know these are difficult and dark questions, but it's important to remember the first step in changing a reality is accurately understanding precisely what the challenges are. I think you've all done a really great job in sharing your experiences. I apologize that we weren't able to get to the many questions that were outstanding, and I think that's just a testament to how rich this conversation was. So on behalf of the organizers, thank you all for your contributions this evening and for everyone who joined us for it.
And if I could just say very quickly, just so we end on maybe a slightly more positive note, because I think we've really sort of gone down into a hole there. You know, you started off by mentioning that, you know, we had put out in July a joint statement.
That's correct.
And the reason we did that, and we've discovered, as you see in this event here, is that our voices combined speak more loudly, carry further than any of us can do individually. And I think the same is true for people who are, you know, who object to what is happening and who want to protest and want to find an outlet for that. I think reaching out and finding other like-minded people, finding community, finding support structures, not only is important to our well-being and our mental health as we try to get through all of this, but also empowers us more than the numbers alone suggest. So we're grateful for the opportunity to be here, and certainly encourage everyone to reach out to any of us, but keep also building those networks and those support structures and raising your voices.
Thank you.
Thank you.